In Dalhart, we about somewhere in the neighborhood of 20-25 bomber crews, B-17 bomber crews, loaded up on a passenger train and headed for, I'm a little confused whether it was Kearney, Nebraska that we were going to be based at or at Grand Isle. One of the places was where the bombers were made, and the other is the air base where we came in by train to pick up a brand new B-17 to take to England. And we were there maybe 2 days in Nebraska. It seemed like somewhere around 8 or 9 o'clock at night we all got loaded onto this B-17. It had been assigned to us. We knew it was going to be ours, and we loaded our gear into it during the course of that day. And then that evening, about dark, we took off and headed east, went across all the way from Nebraska to Manchester, New Hampshire, where there was a base at the time. And we flew in there, spent a couple of days waiting for the weather to break. It was early March, or late February, I guess early March. We had to go from New England up to Goose Bay, Labrador. Goose Bay was the point of departure from the North American continent to go to Europe, with a stop in between at Iceland. So we started out one morning to go to Goose Bay, maybe it's noontime. Anyway, it was about a 5-hour flight. And we got up there when it was kind of getting late in the day. The weather wasn't great. There was some undercast. And there were other bombers, crews that had gotten in there ahead of us. So we wound up circling that thing after a 5-hour flight up there, about 30 or 40 minutes. And they said, go back to New England, and sent us to Presque Isle, Maine. So we went back and kind of started over again.
What's undercast?
Clouds under us.
Oh, okay. Instead of overcast.
Yeah.
Okay.
We went back and stayed about 2 days at Presque Isle. Almost got to go skiing, and then they found out this was an established base that had all kinds of airmen on it. They found out we were about on our way overseas, so they said, no way are we going to let you go skiing and breaking a leg. We got to get you to England. So we didn't get to do anything but kind of sweat out 2 days there waiting for clearance to try again to get to Goose Bay. We went in this time kind of late in the afternoon, 5 hours, or mid-afternoon, 5 hours to get up there. It was almost dark when we got to Goose Bay, and this time we did get to land, and we landed on a snow-packed runway. They had plowed snow off of it until it was about as high as a 2-story building on either side of the runway. Then they took in their roller equipment and packed it down so we could land on it. So we landed on, I don't know how many inches of packed down snow, but at least we got there. And they were all set to let us load up with gasoline that night and take off for England during that same night. But they had so many other planes in there that were ahead of us that about 11 or 12 o'clock at night they said, well, we're not going to get to you until 1 o'clock in the morning or later, so we'll issue you some bedding and you can bed down at one of our barracks here for the night. So we did. The next morning I woke up with a sore jaw and aching, and realized after a bit that I had the mumps that had been going around at Dalhart. So I woke up with all swelled up, and if I didn't know it, everybody else in the barracks knew it from the swelled up face that I had. So I went to their local Army hospital. Again, I saw how much snow they had. On one side of the building, the eave, it was a 1-story building, and on one side I noticed that the eave of the building and the snow on the outside came within about a foot of one another. So they'd had plenty of snow. Anyway, I wound up being there in the hospital for 2 weeks. My crew had left by this time. They had stayed several days. But my crew was gone. They said, you're well enough to travel, so we're going to load you up with another crew, and put me up in the nose with their navigator. And we headed out for Iceland. And we landed at Iceland the next morning. But in the meantime, before we left Goose Bay, they had failed to give me any kind of help getting my baggage to the airplane. And you're not supposed to pick up anything heavy when you're coming out of the mumps. Well, apparently it caught me, because by the time I got to Iceland, actually, I could tell that I was having a relapse. So they said, well, nothing much we can do for you here, so go on to Scotland.
And I don't think I gave the time frame. This is mid-February to mid-March period that the assault took place.
Late February, early March.
Late February.
I think we left Dalhart on about the 15th of February. So it was March by the time I got to the hospital, that's for sure.
In Goose Bay.
In Goose Bay,
okay.
Yeah. So I only spent 24 hours in Iceland. The weather broke well enough for us to get out, and we headed for England. It was very interesting as we approached England, because we had radar, one of the few airplanes in the whole Air Force that had radar on board. We were able to spot the coastline through heavy clouds under us, be sure that we knew where we were. The navigator was pretty well trained, and he had maps that gave him the picture of the rocky outlines of the shore of Scotland. So we landed without any trouble on an island called Stornoway, which is actually north of Scottish mainland. A little aside here, when we were approaching Scotland and couldn't see any land yet, no landmarks, the navigator was reporting where he had us calculated to be, and the co-pilot said, "What is that building down there below us that looks like it has all that Norwegian writing on it?" So he kidded us into thinking that we'd missed Scotland over Norway.
That was the co-pilot?
That was the co-pilot, yeah. Anyway, it was just a funny aside. I went to what they call the flight surgeons. That was the medical corps for the Air Corps. They always call those people flight surgeons. So I went to them and told them what had happened with my health, my mumps. And they said, well, you'd be better off going down to where you're going to go to get your first training in England, which turned out to be Derby. I think it's spelled D-E-R-B-Y, but it's Derby. There was a city in Scotland that I went to first that I can't remember the name of, and then we went to Derby. It was just a short stopover at this Scottish city. So I went in, and the first morning while I was there, I couldn't get anybody to listen to me about going back to the hospital, but the next day they did put me in the hospital. Well, I spent another 3 weeks in the hospital. And from there, after I got recovered again, then we started down to southern England, where the bases were, on the train from Derby. What it amounts to is that we had to go to this Derby, which was what they called a repo depot. That's where they brought airmen in, and then they filled vacancies in the bomber groups in East England. So that was one thing we had to go through, was get an assignment. And then the next thing we had to go through was to go down and get a little training about the specifics of what we'd be doing and how we were to go about it when we got to the base. So we went and spent 2 or 3 days at a city right in the, almost in London. I guess it was maybe 20 miles away, north from London. And from this city, I went down to London on a train and caught a train from London to Nettishall. We got on a train one morning at Derby and proceeded by rail down to a point where there was a base just north of London, and there we had some indoctrination about how to live with the Limeys and what East Anglia was like, and a little bit of toughening up to be ready to join our bomber crews in East Anglia. They told me what mine was, but it didn't mean anything to me. It's Nettishall in East Anglia, which is about halfway between Norwich and Cambridge, northeast of London. But first of all, we had to go to this base north of England and spend a few days getting some more acclimation. The first night we were there, our air raid sirens that were triggered in London, we could hear clear up at this place where we were at about 15 miles north. And we got to watch them set London on fire again, which they did often.
What were they setting London on fire with? It was those
German bombers.
The buzz bombs, or was this planes?
No, these were planes.
Planes. Okay.
They dropped bombs and ignited more fires. There wasn't a whole lot to catch on fire in most parts of London. They'd already been knocked down and burned down. Anyway, in a day after that, they loaded me up on another train to go on into London to catch a train to our base at Nettishall. Well, I decided I'd never been to London before, and I was going to find out when the last train that was going up toward Nettishall was leaving London that night, and spend the time in between exploring London. Well, I was by myself, and of course I was, being young, I was hungry, so I went into a place for lunch downtown in the West End. Found that there was a limit on how much they could serve you, but there were ways of getting around it. The largest meal that they would sell you could cost no more than half a crown, which was something like 50 cents in those days in American money. But the waiter told me, if you're still hungry, we can sell you a second one of those meals. So I said, give me a second one. Anyway, after that I was ready to go out and explore, and I ran across a soldier from Jamaica, a black soldier from Jamaica who was an officer. I met him on a bus while I was trying to explore the place, and he kind of took charge of me and showed me around London. About mid-afternoon, I said, I want some fish and chips, and he said, well, all right, they're all over downtown, let me show you one. So anyway, we went in there. I was hungry again by this time, so we went in and got fish and chips, went into a sidewalk cafe type place and had a few drinks, and by that time it was getting toward the time for the last train to Nettishall. So I got on it, got up there on the evening of the day I was supposed to, and walked into the place and threw my baggage in the barracks where my crew was already installed. It was a one-story metal, what we called a Quonset hut, which was had a kind of a dome shape to it and was long. They called it a Neeson hut, but anyway, it had plenty of bunks in it, and that's where our crew was. They weren't there, so I said, where's the officers club? And they directed me to the officers club, but nobody told me that I was supposed to not wear my hat in there. So I went in with my hat on and ordered a drink, and some major came up to me and said, what are you doing with your hat on? So I learned something right quick, that wasn't allowed. Took it off, and then I was allowed to stay. Everything was all right after that.